And now, a passage from Stories of Indiana, from Chapter 10, Flatboat Days. On the 13th of May, 1816, an election was held in Indiana Territory by which delegates were chosen to meet in convention and frame a state constitution. The vast area which was included in Indiana in 1800 had since been reduced to the present limits of the state by the formation of new territories. Yet in 1816, Indiana Territory had a population of free white people numbering nearly 64,000. The convention met at Corydon with delegates from all the counties, and a constitution was duly framed under which a general election was held on the first Monday in August. Jonathan Jennings was elected governor of the state of Indiana and took his oath of office on November 7, 1816 at Corydon, and on the 11th of December following, Indiana became a state of our Union, and her star went to its place on the nation's flag. To that flag, Indiana has always been true. Early in the history of the Northwestern Territory, an effort had been made to exclude slavery, for there was a considerable number of the settlers who felt that the future of the country would be greatly endangered by the establishment of involuntary servitude in the West. On March 1, 1784, Virginia ceded the Northwestern Territory to the United States, and on the 13th of July, 1787, Congress prohibited slavery in the territory. But slavery continued nevertheless directly in defiance of congressional enactment, and at the time when the subject of statehood for Indiana began to be freely discussed, it was necessary to face the situation and have the vexed question permanently settled. Just across the Ohio lay the state of Kentucky, in which a great many Negroes were lawfully held as thralls. Indiana as a state must be either free or slave. The choice must be made and fixed in the Constitution. On the 14th of December, 1815, the legislature of Indiana Territory addressed a memorial to the National Congress in which it was clearly stated that slavery was not desired as one of the institutions of the proposed Commonwealth, and in his first message to the legislature, Governor Jennings recommended a law for the protection of free persons of color. Indeed, from the beginning of civilization in the great Northwestern Territory, slavery had but feeble foothold, and when Indiana became a state, freedom was fixed in her organic law. From the date of admission into the Union, Indiana was quite free from savage warfare and depredations. Population increased rapidly, a tide of immigration setting in from all the older states, and although most of our people were poor, a period of prosperity and happiness followed. The Indians had become poor, disheartened, and not a little lazy and dissolute, so that the only trouble they made was due to the impossibility of civilizing them. Gradually they were induced to go out of the state until at last only a small remnant was left of all the tribes. It was not long after the commencement of this new life that men of great energy and ability began to urge upon the people's attention the subject of public improvements. Good highways were needed, navigation demanded encouragement from the Commonwealth, and a proper aid must be given to the establishment of a school system. Even before any legislative enactment on the subject of education, the people had begun the work. Cabins once used for blockhouses were taken for school and church purposes, and in most of the settlements, schoolhouses were built. But public improvements were extremely difficult to make in those early days. Money was scarce, and the undeveloped condition of the country offered great obstacles. High taxes could not be borne, nor were the people ready to assume a large debt. Still, if agriculture could not have an outlet for its products, there could be no prosperity. All the rich land in the interior of the state was practically worthless without a means of transportation. As for the roads, they were almost impassable during a large part of the year, as may be seen by the light of the following description, taken in substance from the statements of travelers who passed through Indiana in every direction between 1818 and 1821. In driving a very light two-horse wagon with but a scant amount of household furniture for its load, it was often necessary to take out every piece of this lading and carry it over long stretches of mud, while the horses could scarcely flounder through with the empty vehicle. What was called corduroy, that is, a road made of logs laid side by side at right angles to the line of travel, was the best improvement then known, and over this the wagon bumped and jolted for miles. There were a few ferries across the larger streams, but even mere creeks were for a large part of the year almost impassable. from the line between Ohio and Indiana to a settlement not far from Terre Haute. A great part of the road was only a blazed line, and the way had to be cleared by cutting down trees, removing logs and underbrush, and opening a track through dense brakes. Frequently, a mile was a good day's journey. We can easily imagine the difficulty in the way of marketing agricultural products under such circumstances, especially where the settlement was at a great distance from a navigable stream. Cincinnati and Louisville were the chief marketing points, whither most of the surplus of grain and other farm produce found its way. But either of these places, then small and ill-supplied with means of transportation, was so far away from the interior of Indiana that it was a long, wearisome, and laborious journey at best, choose whichever the pioneer might. New Orleans, indeed, was the great port of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, and from the earliest days of Western settlement, a visit to the famous Crescent City was the chief desire of everyone who dreamed of travel. The Wabash River was navigable for light draft flatboats and keelboats during a large part of the year, far above Lafayette. White River and a number of smaller tributaries were used as channels by which to reach the Wabash, and all the available streams falling into the Ohio were similarly utilized. Indeed, flatboating was one of the most profitable and picturesque features of early commercial activity. A journey, or voyage, as it was called, from Terre Haute, Vincennes, or Lawrenceburg, to the far-off city of the Creoles, set in the warm lowlands of Louisiana, was an experience full of lively adventures and constantly enriched with lovely variations of scenery. Long after the introduction of steamboats, this means of navigation was very profitable to the hardy men who pursued it as a vocation. Flatboating was a very simple business. Late in summer or early in autumn, according to the cargo in view, a boat was built and launched. It was a rough piece of work, being scarcely more than a large, shallow, flat-bottomed scow, with a sort of house amidships. A long steering oar at the stern and a sufficient number of side oars constituted the propelling machinery. The boat was loaded at a rude wharf, and for most of the voyage the current of the river was depended upon much more than the oars to bear the craft along its way. The crew usually consisted of the owner of the boat and a number of hired men. In 1812, the first steamboat passed down the Ohio from Pittsburgh and went puffing and wheezing all the way to New Orleans. This was the beginning of a new era of prosperity in the West and South. But steamboats did not immediately interfere with the business of flatboating. On the contrary, a strong impetus was given to it. The flatboatman could now voyage leisurely down to New Orleans, there dispose of his cargo, sell his boat for what it would bring, and return with his pocketed profits on board a steamboat. The Ohio and the Wabash now became immensely important to Indiana. Almost every road led to their banks, where flourishing little towns soon grew up, and where every sort of trade useful to the country showed great activity. But the roads themselves were bad almost beyond what is credible. An enterprising man living in the interior of Indiana, when he made up his mind to try a speculation in the way of buying a cargo of produce and shipping it to New Orleans, found his undertaking one of great hardships and worries, not to count the actual dangers. But such a venture had its mighty fascination, and not unfrequently the speculator's family went with him on the long, slow voyage. While the flatboat was being built at the most convenient point on the river, wagons were hauling the prospective cargo to the spot, where it was safely housed, and when all was ready, the loading began. Meantime, the owner's family had made a long trip in a covered wagon, over the hills and across the prairies, and through the swamps, arriving at the place of embarkment, worn and tired, but eagerly looking forward to the day when they should be afloat. The accommodations of an ample flatboat were by no means cramped as compared with what dwellers in log cabins were accustomed to. The family had a small sleeping room, well sheltered, and the deck afforded space for open-air life in good weather, with plenty of provisions, good health, and the constant stimulus of ever-changing and novel scenery. Every person on board found the voyage delightful. Of course, rainy weather often interfered with the full enjoyment of the outdoor scenes, and sometimes a windstorm would force the boat to seek shelter in some nook of the shore until the danger was past. The voyage to New Orleans usually began when the weather in Indiana was growing cold. The long winter was coming on, with gray days and icy winds from the northwest. But there was not yet any ice in the Wabash, or in the Ohio, or its smaller navigable tributaries. And what was most desired was to get beyond the freezing line before any ice obstruction could form. All hands therefore were kept actively at work until the boat crept out of the mouth of the Ohio and turned its prow southward down the broad current of the Mississippi. And so for weeks and months the cheerful voyagers floated on their way. A few small towns had grown up by the great river's side. At these the boats stopped, sometimes for a week's sojourn, while the owner and his family enjoyed the hospitality of the best inhabitants. Dances and dinners were given in their honor, provided they bore letters of introduction from well-known persons, and the long journey was thus made very attractive in a social way. Day after day the winter weather of the north gave place to softer sunshine and balmier winds. Along the river's banks the perpetual green of the southern climate began to show itself instead of the leafless, frost-crisped trees to which the voyagers had been accustomed. Flocks of waterfowl haunted the still bayous and overflow lakes, or flew overhead in vast cloud-like bodies. Deer were often seen at the water's edge browsing amid the green canebrakes. At that time there were no levees, and in many places the river spread out over miles of country now in cultivation. Late in winter, perhaps the flatboat reached New Orleans after stopping at Natchez under the Hill and at various Creole landings farther down. It was a memorable experience, this arrival at the metropolis of the Mississippi Valley. Our Hoosier family found themselves in the midst of a people quite strange and interesting to them. On every side they heard the glib speech of the French traders and the soft patois of the colored people. Every sight, every sound was novel and attractive. It was quite easy to sell the boat and the cargo, usually at most profitable prices, and so after a delightful stay in the city, the return home was made in good time on a steamboat. Nor need it be doubted that the family which had made such a voyage with success came back among their friends in Indiana with glowing accounts of their experiences. Hoosiers who had traveled so far and seen so much were looked upon as fortunate indeed. At just this point, it is well enough to say that the nickname Hoosier, as applied to Indiana people, is of uncertain origin. It has been said that it arose out of the backwoods men's pronunciation of the word here, which was yer. When a stranger knocked at the door of a cabin in Indiana, the inmate would clutch his gun and pistol, and going close to the shutter, would call out, "Hoosier!" In time, the name Hoosiers was fastened upon the inhabitants of the state. Doubtless this explanation is based upon a clever guess, but in the absence of a better story, it will serve its purpose, and will let the historian escape from an enforced confession of ignorance. But if the inhabitants of Indiana who dwelt far off from any navigable stream had the worst possible means of marketing their produce, they yet were able to live in reasonable comfort. They had plenty to eat, vegetables, fruit, excellent bread, pork, and game. They grew flax, spun it, and wove their linen cloth. They raised sheep, from the wool of which they made their winter clothing, so they had small need of money. A few of the old-time spinning wheels, the small ones with treadles, the large ones to be turned by hand, are still preserved as curiosities, and at wide intervals, in the rural nooks distant from railroads, the old hand loom may be seen under its lean-to shed behind a cabin. But the day of these primitive engines of domestic industry is over. Along with the maul and wedge for splitting rails, and the heavy cradle for cutting grain by hand, many other implements suited to backwoods civilization have disappeared. The flatboat lingers dolefully on the rivers, and even steamboats have lost their old-time splendor. But it is well to remember the steps by which we have made the great progress of the past 70 or 80 years. And this mention of flatboats, mauls, and wedges, and rail splitting somehow calls up the name dearest to Americans, reminds us of the greatest man of modern times, and perhaps of all times, Abraham Lincoln, whose life in Indiana we will sketch in the next chapter. If you enjoy High Americana, please head on over to Patreon, where you can support the channel and audio requests can be made. Thank you.